November 13th, 2023, Carmen and her 16-year-old son, Axel, were killed by her ex-partner, Adrian Roman, in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Just a few weeks prior, he had strangled and threatened to kill her. Charges were pressed against him, and a warrant for his arrest was issued on November 1st. Carmen also filed for a protection order against Roman related to the incident. The First Judicial District Court issued a temporary no-contact order the next day and scheduled a hearing on November 29th to consider a long-term protective order. Despite having done everything she had the power to do, Carmen and Axel lost their lives to domestic violence. The systems failed to protect them, and unfortunately, this is not the only case where a gap in response has had deadly outcomes.
So New Mexico ranks one of the highest in lethality, so homicides, for intimate partner survivors of domestic violence. We rank anywhere between 2nd and 9th over the last 10 years, consistently ranking around 2nd in the nation per capita of intimate partner violence-related homicides.
In 2008, New Mexico codified into law a New Mexico Intimate Partner Death Review Team to address and evaluate the deaths related to intimate partner violence.
And what that's done since 2008, when they were codified, until now, is we have an immense amount of data that shows us how many homicides are happening in New Mexico, where they're happening, and through the team and it being codified into state law, they're able to look at case records and look for gaps in the system, see where there were successes, but also see where we as a community need to address intimate partner violence and homicide. We think about domestic violence as something that's very private, that happens behind the closed doors of someone's home. But what we know from this data is homicides are occurring, about 30% of them happen in homes, but 30% of them happen in public, right? In addition to different places around communities. So domestic violence homicides are happening everywhere, and they're impacting everyone in community. We're able to look at all that data for an extensive period of time, and that data can help what we're doing in our coordinated responses across the state to address domestic violence in ways that other communities haven't been able to.
New Mexico has actually dedicated funding towards coordinated community responses. We have reoccurring state appropriations that is dedicated to this response. No other state in the country can say that they're dedicating funding to establishing coordination in communities that are addressing intimate partner violence.
This effort, also known as the Coordinated Community Response Project, was headed by the New Mexico Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
So the coalition's role in the Coordinated Community Response Project is to help facilitate community organizers in local communities.
We are not a resource-rich state. Not every single one of our communities has the funding and the resources to have a designated organizer within their community.
Domestic violence service providers, just like our courts and our prosecution and our law enforcement, don't always have the human capital, an individual who can help those entities begin that infancy, that planning process to put a coordinated community response together.
That's another thing that's different about coordinated community response is that there is a designated organizer. There's one person that is responsible for building relationship, reviewing and understanding the roles, the policies and procedures of all system partners. And that's an important piece of a coordinated response, is having that organizer who has that legacy information of how are we responding and how are the interventions that we're going to put in place based on the information from survivors going to land in community.
And so we're leading the nation and we're leading our state in developing these relationships within communities. And so the reoccurring funding, the establishing the human capital, the individuals who are helping the boots on the ground, but also really making sure that the leaders, the decision makers, are at the table making those decisions to address those system gaps, those system successes, and to continue to push forward in addressing intimate partner violence.
We recognize that our community response needs to be uniquely tailored to each community across New Mexico. And in recognizing this, we have the ability to place organizers in communities. And right now we have 3 focus site communities. Right now in Taos County, we have Diana Ariola as their community organizer for CCR. In Doña Ana County, we have Flor Gonzalez. And most recently in McKinley County, we have brought on Diane Nakai. And these organizers are from these communities, understand the unique dynamics of these communities, and are able to serve the system and community response partners. Explanation of what's a coordinated community response, right? So if you kind of look at that, it's an interagency approach addressing the climate of tolerance of battering in communities that institutionalize policies and practices that are centered on survivor safety and offender accountability. Which at the same time, what does that even mean? What does that mean? And I think the best analogy for myself and that I explain to community members is when you think about an assembly line. So there are teams on assembly lines. There are entire framers that do the framework for the vehicle. There's entire electrical crews. There's glass crews, right? And each one of those crews, they know what to do because they're oriented by policy and procedure, right? And when we're looking at this assembly line, that's like the systems that respond to intimate partner violence within our communities. So when that survivor reaches out and calls for that call for help, there's an assembly line, a systems response to that call for help. In most instances, in a majority of the communities across our state, it starts with that 911 call. So that survivor reaches out to 911. That 911 person then reaches out to dispatch, who is then going to contact the field officer that's going to respond on scene. So in majority of communities, when that law enforcement officer responds, he's also going to connect to what we call our domestic violence service organizations. And this is where you're going to find advocates that work with our survivors. So we've got our domestic violence service organization in place. We've got our criminal complaint from our law enforcement officer. And the next step is going to go to our DA, who's going to rely on our criminal code to then be able to hold that offender accountable. If our DA gets a criminal complaint that doesn't allow for that, then the offender accountability piece is not being centered, which in a coordinated community response, survivor safety and offender accountability run in tandem. They need to be centered at every step of our intervention process. So let's say we got a great criminal complaint and that district attorney has said, yes, I can move forward. I can use our criminal code. So we're gonna go through the criminal and or the civil legal system. And now let's say that advocate supported that survivor and that survivor says, I need to get a protection order because I am not safe and my children aren't safe. So that's going to go more into like a civil justice response. Now let's come back to that DA, right? He's doing all the criminal justice. So we're going to have judges that are listening on to what evidence is being presented of what happened with the survivor and what can we do in a system response to hold this offender accountable. So a next portion of our system response typically comes into our probation and parole. They're oriented to know that if a sentence comes down from a judge, that their job is to hold that court order accountable while also maintaining the other services that this offender may need, right? So we have in New Mexico batterer intervention programs.
And so we have a lot of work to do to make those systems accessible to those survivors, because we know that about 60 to 70% of anyone experiencing intimate partner violence doesn't engage in any system at all.
So not all of our survivors do access our legal and civil and criminal justice systems, right? And that's where the community portion of a coordinated community response comes in. Yes, our system partners are a part of our communities, but there are other avenues that survivors seek, right? There's going to be faith-based communities, educational systems, friends, those one-to-ones, our family members, those trusted individuals that we have in our lives. And this is why it's so important to not only focus on a systems response being coordinated, but also a community's response being coordinated. Because we as a community also have a responsibility in the climate of tolerance of battering in our state and our communities.
What we know is we continue to rank one of the highest, second, third, fourth, highest in intimate partner violence-related homicides. We rank about 23rd in the nation for intimate partner violence, but we know our Hispanic communities experience that at greater rates. We know our indigenous communities experience that at much higher rates.
Survivors deserve a coordinated response. The end goal is to say, as a state, as individual communities within our state, that we do not tolerate this type of violence of any of our members. And we're going to hold our systems accountable, we're going to hold our communities accountable, and this is going to hopefully reach up to our state level, right? Our criminal code dictates how we hold offenders accountable within our criminal and civil justice systems. We need that to also support survivors as well. So I would say the end goal is definitely going to be dictated by each community and the survivors within those communities.